Okay, this second part of this lecture will focus on the concept and phenomenon of black swans. And I'll review quickly, relatively quickly, two articles that deal with this phenomenon. One is Jervis's article, which is a review of of a book written by Nassim Taleb from 2007, The Black Swan. And Nassim Taleb, he really popularized the concept of the black swan. And the black swan, just to be brief about the definition, is something unexpected. Something unexpected which cannot really be predicted and which also has a huge impact. A black swan, says Nassim Taleb, is an outlier as it lies outside the realm of regular expectations because nothing in the past can convincingly point to its possibility. Second, it carries an extreme impact. And third, in spite of its outlier status, human nature makes us concoct explications for its occurrence after the fact, making it explainable and predictable. In hindsight, that's what we refer to as retrospective predictability. Now, the black swan concept is important in itself. It's also important because I want you to, when it comes to your term papers, consider, the things that are the unexpected things that can happen in 2020, 2021. Of course, the coronavirus was one such event, not a political event, but it has political consequences. But I want you to use your imagination. You don't have to focus on any black swan or pick any black swan, but I want you to reflect on these issues, that all the things that we think we know might happen in 2020, 2021, as Eurasia Group, they go through 10 of these possibilities, but not really the black swans. And this is hugely challenging, of course. By definition, black swans are unpredictable. But it is also useful to reflect on this concept, on the way that international relations, on the way that our societies and the world as a whole, developments are often shaped by these dramatic events that nobody really foresees. And that's kind of the clue about the social sciences, that it's often difficult to predict. It's an art rather than a science, and that places the social sciences kind of in opposition to what we refer to as hard sciences. There are challenges when it comes to human behavior. But in particular, if you remember that this is something unexpected, the black swan is something unexpected, an outlier, and second, that it carries an extreme impact. And then, of course, you can add the third element of this definition, retrospective predictability. The tendency that people have to, when something happens, we go back and we find this, these links, these chains of events that lead up to this unexpected thing. That's the benefits of hindsight. Everything seems so natural in hindsight. I'll get back soon to the First World War, which is a prominent such event that, caught many people, a lot of people by surprise, a lot of leaders by surprise when it happened. But afterwards, many people have suggested that, we should have seen, or the people at the time should have seen the signs. So they concoct explanations in hindsight. Okay. Black swans, fat tails, and non-linearity. Three, concepts that really describe the same thing. Risk equals impact times probability. That's the standard definition. And those two things, and I referred to those things when I spoke about the term papers, you have to consider possible events by looking at the possible impact. Nuclear war has a high impact. Regulatory change normally has little real impact on the world or on world business. But the nuclear war has a very low probability, one might, confidently assert. Whereas regulatory changes in tax regimes, etc., carries a much larger probability. And when we consider risks, we have to consider both of these concepts and weigh them against each other. Okay, at the bottom here you see a normal distribution, a so-called bell curve, which really describes predictable things. A lot of things in nature and also in human behavior can be confidently predicted, unlike these black swans. So we often, and in the statistics courses, we often refer to this normal distribution, this bell curve. This makes things predictable. For instance, if you take the insurance companies, again, the example of the insurance companies, they get their profits through estimating the likelihood that, that people are involved in car crashes, that people die early or late, and a lot of these things, people fall ill, and they can say these things, the number of people falling ill to serious illnesses, or the number of people involved in a car crash or having their car stolen, they know that next year, X number of people, plus minus a few, will experience these things. That enables them to price their insurance premiums according to these statistical patterns. That's regularity. Sometimes you have extreme years, and the coronavirus year is probably extreme. If insurers insure people who get robbed, their car gets robbed in Sweden, say, on vacation, like my car or our car in last year, actually. This year is special because people don't go to Sweden. So this exact year, in that respect, belongs, to the tail of this distribution. But normally every year, in terms of car robberies for Norwegian people in Sweden or elsewhere, and in Norway, it really stays normally, around the middle. And, that's regularity, predictability. The same goes, of course, for the distribution of heights in a population. There's nothing major changing from year to year in that respect. And that's also the case for life expectancy. I mean, people can die young, people can die really, really old, but on average, insurance companies and ourselves, we know approximately how many people die in a year, in a given year. But political events and international relations events are different. Much of international relations happen according to a pattern. The globalization phenomenon and relative stability in the world and rules of the game, international institutions often ensure that tomorrow is the same as today, and businesses know that tomorrow will most likely be the same as today. until something extreme happens. And these extreme events in the tail of the normal distribution. And that's kind of some of the clue about the black swans, the tail risks. These are quite common, actually, according to Nassim Taleb and many others, quite common in international relations. Not that they happen every day, that there's a war or a big, a coup d'etat which has happened actually yesterday in Mali. But they happen. And they often have an extreme impact. Wars in particular, interstate wars, they leave a legacy. Not only an immediate legacy, but a legacy far, far away in the future. The Chinese, for instance, they remember vividly. The politicians in China use that also in their rhetorics. They used what they call the century of humiliation, running from the mid-19th century to 1949, the end of the Civil War. So it began, in the mid-19th century by European countries really carving up parts of China and dominating China and governing and shaping the economic policy and the policies, domestic policies and foreign policies of China. And then came the Japanese with their expansion and colonization. And then you had the Second World War. And that century really forms, a huge part of the basis for Chinese thinking. We're gonna get strong because the century of humiliation was a one-off. It will never happen again. A lot of these things in that century are kind of, things that happen near the tails of the normal distribution. And they have an extreme impact on China, and they still have an extreme impact on China, and then by definition almost the world. And wars are like that. Wars are rare. Interstate wars are rare. Civil wars are less rare. Interstate wars are rare, but extreme in their impact. So when I refer, for instance, to Greece and Turkey, like I did in the first part of the lecture, they have a history of wars. And the most recent, perhaps most dramatic events were, at the end of the First World War and in the immediate aftermath. And that also leaves a legacy, which you see actually today in current events. So, according to Nassim Taleb, the most important events in the world tend to be those that are rare, extreme in their impact, and not predictable statistically or otherwise with any consistency. It's hard to predict based on statistical material, based on empirics. It's hard to predict developments in international relations. You can often say something useful. You can come with hypotheses and possible paths that the world or regions or individual countries might take. But it's really hard to be too confident about these things. There's a lot of things we do not really comprehend, and we do not have the statistical basis for saying that, we don't have the regularity of patterns which can lead us to say that, there's a 59% likelihood of there being a war between China and the US in the next year. We can't say that. So international relations and human behavior, sometimes at least, is not really predictable. Some human behavior is predictable, one should add. In particular, when a lot of people, thousands of people, millions of people act, because then you often get, for instance, in the economic sphere. So a lot of field of economics is based on regularity and expectations with a statistical basis, but a lot of things aren't that way. And this is in particular what Robert Jervis deals with, you know, the international relations field vis-a-vis Nassim Taleb's arguments. Because Taleb, one should add, he's quite critical of the academic world, in particular economics, and say that they pretend to know things that they do not really know. They pretend to be able to predict when they're not able to predict, because things are happening in the tails of the distribution, which changes everything. A financial crisis like in 2008, 2009, it changes a lot, and people don't predict that. Experts don't predict that. So, just to give you some examples of this is a list, and some of these issues are, some of these events, developments, dramatic things are commented on by Robert Jervis. As I briefly mentioned, World War I is such an event. It happened in 1914. It was the summer crisis of 1914. And then the question that Robert Jervis really asks, an important question, and to be fair, a question that many people have asked. Was that really something unexpected, or was it not? And I can't go through, you know, the whole run-up to the First World War. A lot of things happened in July. It was the July crisis. Austria-Hungary, this empire, had to settle some felt. They had to settle some scores with Serbia, because Austria-Hungary was afraid that the empire would dissolve because of Serbian nationalism, Yugoslav nationalism, really South Slav nationalism. And Germany supported Austria-Hungary, and then Russia got scared and they mobilized. And of course, Germany's war plans was to knock out France, which was an ally to Russia. And then the United Kingdom also got involved. So suddenly, within the space of a few weeks after Austria-Hungary had attacked Serbia, the whole of Europe was in a war that lasted over 4 years and left millions of people dead. Nobody really wanted that war, or at least the vast majority of people, of leaders and of military leaders as well. There are exceptions to that. Nobody certainly wanted a 4-year war, long war, which really helped destroy Europe, or Europe's prominence in world affairs. Before the First World War, there was a lot of crisis, which made really leaders, people, the military, made them complacent, because these crises, you know, with the risk of war, they were solved. But still, and these were crises over, you know, over dominance over Morocco, between France and Germany. It was crises in the Balkans, several crises in the Balkans, involving Russia, involving Austria-Hungary, involving Germany, and basically involving every great power in Europe. So these crises, repeated crises, one got used to these being solved. But still, our knowledge is such that we know that there's a risk of war in every such crisis. And if the July crisis hadn't happened, when the heir to the Austrian Empire, Franz Ferdinand, was murdered by a Serbian terrorist, if that hadn't happened, something else might have happened that would have caused these war plans and these grievances to boil over into real war. So even if World War I, when it did happen in August 1914, even if that felt like a total surprise, extreme event, it certainly was unexpected, one might argue that maybe it wasn't that unexpected after all. There were a lot of driving forces. Some people call the World War I overdetermined, because you had militarization, you had social Darwinism. You had intense rivalry between these European empires. And you had these repeated crises, and you had nationalism, and you had domestic problems, real problems in these empires, and in Germany as well, domestic issues that had international consequences. So the point is really that and Jervis raises this point, is really to ask the question, was World War I really a black swan? And Jervis asked that question more broadly. He says that something like, it's hard to define what is a black swan. And he spends some time on that. Maybe it's easier when it comes to World War II, because it's certainly hard to describe that as a black swan, because many people reckon that these dissatisfied states, in particular Germany, but partly also Italy and Japan, if you go to Asia, many people saw what was coming, that these countries were hell-bent on changing the rules of the game, on changing the division of territory, on changing borders, on changing international institutions through military means, if necessary. And we know that from the crisis of 1935, 36, 37, and the Sudetenland crisis in Czechoslovakia in 1938, the annex or the Anschluss, the merging of Austria and Germany in that same year. All these things were harbingers of things to come. So World War was not really something unexpected, one might argue. The 1979 Iranian Revolution is important in a political risk context, because that spurred a lot of thinking in academia, in politics, in business, spurred a lot of thinking and soul-searching when it comes to political developments. And a long story short, the issue here is that the Americans dominated Iran. It was the key ally of the US in the Middle East during the Cold War. So the Shah, or the king of Iran, was an American ally. And suddenly you had something happening domestically in Iran, which caused eventually the Shah, the king, to flee. And in came Ayatollah Khomeini with his radical Islamic views. And the state of Iran turned upside down, and the Americans were kicked out. All the businesses, American businesses, were kicked out. The military, the politicians, and the dominance and the influence of the US in Iran was history within the space of a few weeks and months, actually. And that caught the Americans by surprise. And one asked the question, how could this happen without us knowing it? So the CIA, the External Intelligence Bureau of the Americans, they were criticized a lot for not picking up on the signals, the unpopularity of the Shah, the domestic issues and grievances of the population. So that helped spur interest in political risk, on political developments as a stumbling block and danger for international business, in this case mostly American business. But again, it's hard to say with confidence that this is a black swan, because afterwards you might, think that we should have seen the signs. And that was what CIA was criticized for. There were domestic issues and domestic conflicts and dissatisfaction with the regime. It was clear cut. And there were other things, the reluctance of the Shah to use his security services to basically kill people. And killing people often helps, unfortunately, in such a revolutionary situation. But the question remains, is that a black swan or not? So that's an interesting discussion, brief discussion that Robert Jervis has excuse me, in that paper. And then more recently, you had the end of the Cold War, the end of the 1980s, and then finally the dissolution of the Soviet Union in the Christmas of 1991. So you had the end of the Cold War, and the thing there is that, you know, you can say that very few people expected the Cold War to end when it did. A lot of people thought this would go on forever. In 2020, we would still have the Soviet Union and the US engaged in a rivalry, two blocks, no real globalization, to put it like that. But that changed, or it didn't turn out that way. But again, the same thing as with the Iranian Revolution, you did have signs, and you can see that in hindsight, that the economic problems of the Soviet Union were big. The economy of the Soviet Union couldn't really follow the technological developments. It was a command economy, centrally governed. It works on certain areas of production, capital goods and steel works and big things, basically. But in terms of consumer needs and wants, it gets too complicated. And that was clear by the end of the 1970s, by the 1980s, that was pretty clear. And then you got Mikhail Gorbachev, the new leader, because the Soviet leaders, they tended to die one after another in the early 1980s. And then you got a new man with new ideas, really. A younger man with new ideas. And that single individual also inadvertently, because he didn't mean that, he didn't mean that the Soviet Union would collapse. That was not his intention. But that's also a case for international relations, for social sciences, that you're dealing with individuals who can change really the world if they have the position they had. And Mikhail Gorbachev, he really changed the direction of the world. And you can't really, can you predict that a single individual would do this and that and help cause the end of the Cold War? So it was a mix, that particular incident, between deeper sources connected to economic issues, connected to military issues, coupled with a single individual who was gearing towards change in the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union was in problems. Then you had 9/11 in September 11th, the terrorist attacks in the US, the most dramatic thing that has happened in the US since almost ever, in the mainland of the US. It had dramatic impact. It totally changed the direction of the US foreign policy. And the US isn't used to being attacked in their homeland. It happened during the Second World War in the Hawaiian Islands. The Japanese attacked, but it was not, the homeland of the US. So we have to go back actually to 1812 to find the last time the US was really attacked. US homeland was attacked by a foreign power. That was the British in over 200 years ago. Of course, Al-Qaeda is not a state, but that was such a dramatic act that it totally changed the direction of US foreign policy. But was it possible to predict it? Was this a black swan or was it not a black swan? And again, it's difficult. Now we know, or the Americans know, and they've reviewed, the information they had. And they had information indicating that something was going might happen. But of course, it's so much noise in such areas. You have so many bits of information, and you have to find the essence. What does this mean? Is this real? Do they plan an attack? Is it immediate? Is it in the future? Is it etc. So it's hard to say. The consequences of the Iraq invasion in 2003, probably not the black swan, because informed people beforehand, they would warn against the exact consequences in terms of sectarianism, the opposition towards the occupation power of the US, the risk of civil war, the risk of spillover to other countries in the region. Perhaps a better black swan example is the example that is briefly reviewed in the second article on the readings for today, the Arab Spring, which happened in the end, near the end of 2010. A Tunisian man, dissatisfied with the way with his economic opportunities, really, and the way the regime behaved, set himself on fire, and suddenly all of these countries in the region, North Africa and the Middle East, or most of these countries, are in turmoil. Demonstrations, regimes fall, you have civil wars eventually in Yemen and in Syria, and you know, dictatorships fall. Mubarak in Hosni Mubarak in Egypt falls, the most dramatic example. Perhaps you have big demonstrations in Iran, you have big demonstrations in Bahrain, which are, you know, solved by military intervention from Saudi Arabia. You have all these things going on, a revolution, an Arab Spring, change. And nobody really saw beforehand that this would happen in 2010, 2011. These regimes seemed stable. The Syrian regime seemed extremely stable. For instance, Tunisian regime, extremely stable. Egypt, same regime for years and years and years, same leader. But still underneath, you know, this seeming stability, you could, in hindsight at least, point to, you know, levels of corruption, dissatisfaction in large parts of you know, the local communities and people at large. A lack of economic opportunities and all these troubling signs, and a lack of political freedom, not least in the vast majority of these countries. So again, it's difficult to really settle on whether or not this was a real black swan. And then you had at the bottom, of course, Brexit and Trump, which is, you know, if you go back 5 years, what's, you know, and what's the likelihood of Donald Trump becoming president? Most people would laugh or call it laughable, even the thought of Donald Trump becoming president. People would say that about Brexit as well. Now, we know that the British are really, you know, they're reluctant when it comes to European affairs. It's always been like that. They're kind of isolated. They used to have their empire focusing on non-European affairs, and they've always been reluctant. But really, to cut these ties formally with the European Union, very few people thought, I mean, even hours before the election, very few people thought that this was really a possibility. The British cannot be that stupid, was, and this is kind of condescending, the message sent from many circles, elites and such elements. Point is that even if we knew that the, you know, people in Britain was almost split on the issue, very few people really believe that, you know, the majority would want to when decision day came, the majority would want to leave the EU. So in terms of definition, it's really a sort of a philosophical issue. Is this a black swan? Is it not? Was this totally unexpected, or did people warn? Were there, you know, signs and developments beforehand that could have made that event a kind of a natural end point. Okay, so that was a longer than I expected introduction to this area. Black swans explain almost everything in the world is the message from Nassim Taleb, not necessarily from Robert Jervis. And Nassim Taleb also says that the effect of black swans has been increasing. And he analytically separates between what he calls Mediocristan, a world of bell curves, normal distributions, a world of regularity, the world we often try to make for ourselves, to create predictability. Human beings, I think most human beings are really not geared toward a world of instability, of uncertainty. Maybe when you're young, you want, the days to be new and fresh and experience new things, and dramatic events perhaps are welcomed sometimes. Perhaps less so when you get older. But most people would want stability, predictability. Tomorrow we know with reasonable confidence that tomorrow will be exactly like today. That the economy will be stable, that international politics will be stable, that nothing dramatic happens to our nation, our community, our family, etc. But then Taleb says that we have a second, ideal type world, Extremistan, where you do not know what tomorrow will bring, or next week, or the month, or next month. A fat-tail world, a world that is less predictable. And it's a useful, many people, many papers, articles, books, make this, analytical separation between different ideal type worlds, which make it easier for us to understand that there are different possibilities. Of course, both are an exaggeration. We know perfectly well that we don't have perfect predictability. We don't have a perfect Mediocristan. We don't either have a perfect Extremistan, because that would be a world impossible to live in, really, for human beings. Impossible to invest in. If we take the perspective of international businesses, you can't invest with confidence in a fat-tail world, a perfect fat-tail world, because you have no idea that whether or not your investment will still be there tomorrow or next week or next month. Stability for businesses, stability is a key word. Mediocristan is the preferred, for most, the preferred ideal type word. So a lot of these issues, whether you're an ordinary human being, you're a business, you're a multinational business, a total Extremistan don't work. So Nassim Taleb, he also says that we should be careful about listening to economic forecasters or predictions in social science, in particular in economics, or finance, which is really Taleb's background. They are mere entertainers. Newspapers, the media often asks experts to predict. They often, frame their questions in a way, what will happen now? And I know that from experience, and part of me wants to say each time that how the hell should I know? I have no idea what happens next in this, Iran conflict, North Korea conflict, or NATO-Russia conflict. Very little idea at least. And Taleb would say that all of us who comment on things, we're entertainers. We don't know. We answer questions, and sometimes we hit the nail on the head, other times we fail, and it's kind of 50-50. You could roll a dice or flip a coin, and you would hit and miss as much as experts. except for myself, I often hit more than I miss. Not really. But do you make your own forecast for the picnic? By all means, demand certainty for the next picnic, but avoid government social security forecasts for the year 2040. So don't plan. Even though I'm starting to getting old, I don't, do pension planning. I know that a lot of experts want young people to plan for their retirement, I think. So in that sense, I agree with Taleb. It's better to wait a few decades. Okay. Further with Robert Jervis, Black Swans in Politics. And he points to some of these issues about the problems with human beings and their actions and predictability, and basing your acts on statistical experience or non-statistical experience. One of the issues concerns that patterns of the past may not continue. And there's a lot of, uncertainties. Driving is such a thing. If you drive like a maniac, things are fine for 100 rides or 200 rides or 300 rides. But of course, in the 400 ride you make recklessly, you end up dead. We had the second... Another example, the management of the militarized crisis, which I referred to a few minutes ago, before 1914. You had the Bosnian crisis in 1908, you had the Balkan Wars in 1912 and 13, you had the Moroccan crisis a few years earlier. These patterns of solving these militarized crises, you solve 1, you solve 2, you solve 3, you solve 5 and 10, which they did prior to 1914. People or states were on the brink of something, war-like. But each crisis was solved, and that creates a pattern. But that pattern, when it comes to human beings, doesn't necessarily stretch far out into the future. And the lessons from the summer of 1914, tell us that. The pattern didn't last. Secondly, our intellectual shortcomings. We overestimate, is one argument, overestimate our understanding and our abilities to predict. Experts, academics, politicians, and ordinary people who also like to predict. So patterns of the past may not continue, and we are not as smart as we often think we are. Jervis agrees with a lot of these elements and arguments in Taleb's book. But he doesn't agree with, and to be fair, I've read Taleb's book, and he's extremely arrogant in his writing, as many academics are. It's a good book. He goes too far on with respect to certain things. He's condescending to a great degree, actually, not least towards his own profession, finance and economics. But it's a good book, and Jervis, important book, important that it's popularized. Robert Jervis says something that is, in my view, entirely correct. In international relations, IR, we do focus on black swans. That's often what we do. We do focus on the big events, because we know that the big events, the world wars, the big great power rivalries, big economic shocks, and similar events, big revolutions, they are the things that drive history and shape the future. And these are fairly rare events, most of them. And we know that they have a huge impact, we know that they're rare, we know that they're often difficult to predict. So in international relations, black swans are an integral part So when Taleb says that social sciences, they don't care much about black swans, it's partly correct, but in international relations and in a lot of other fields within the social sciences, I would reckon, but particularly I think in international relations, black swans are an integral part. And it's difficult to determine if an event was anticipated. That is that is something which, when I refer to these examples of possible black swans, that's kind of the message that we don't know, and it's unclear often what you can refer to as a black swan. Sarajevo, you know, when Franz Ferdinand was shot in the summer of 1914, was not predicted. Of course it was not. But some kind of war, military conflict, you know, was not totally unexpected. But that particular incident which drove the particular events in 1914, you know, that was certainly a surprise. Nobody knows when you go to Sarajevo, which is in Bosnia, when you go to Sarajevo, you don't expect to be shot. I don't expect to be shot if I go to Sarajevo. Franz Ferdinand didn't expect that in 1914. His wife was also shot, Sophie. But the underlying forces and the lead up to the summer of 1914 was worrisome with respect to the likelihood of war. So, and of course, to call World War II a black swan is to stretch the concept too far. It's a big event, major impact, but after a few years, at least after Adolf Hitler and his Nazi regime came to power in Germany, effectively in January 1933, but the years, you know, you saw developments in the following years. You saw the same thing vis-a-vis Italy and Japan in East Asia, but particularly in Germany. It was a regime that was hell-bent on overturning the European order and really the world order by military means, by military threats. So it's difficult to argue that World War II came out of the blue. And he goes on, and Robert Jarvis is a joy to read, and there's not many people, perhaps none, in international relations who write so much and so good about so many different topics. And now he touches on black swans. And he asks the questions, and he discusses these things, and you know, in a somewhat philosophical way, goes to the bottom of definitions and using countless empirical examples. So he asks, which turning points are black swans and which are street cars? You know, with reference to you know, there's always a streetcar coming in a big, you know, US city, so you can get from point A to B. You just don't know exactly when it comes, and that's part of the thing. Some sort of military conflict you would possibly have in 1913, 14, 15, 16, but you didn't know exactly when that event happened. And he offers some examples, being mugged in New York. It's a dramatic event and can have a high impact, of course, on individuals. Robert Jarvis, he lives in New York, and he knows that, you know, it would be a black swan for him if he was mugged tomorrow. But over his lifetime, if you live in New York, you are going to get mugged eventually. And is it fair to call that a black swan then? Climate change, he discusses, you know, it's a huge impact, but is it fair to call that a black swan? Because we have discussed this for years, and we know about, you know, or experts know about these processes and the mechanisms and all that. World War I, which I've discussed, you know, the Korean War as well, 1950, 1953. You know, the Korean War spurred a whole new level in the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union, because the US really, it framed that war when North Korea invaded South Korea after having gotten a green light from the Soviet Union and partly from communist China. That changed calculations in the US concerning the threat of communism, Soviet communism, and partly also Chinese communism. So the US really entered the Cold War with these communist countries in 1950 after this surprise attack. And I think Jervis asked the questions, you know, if you hadn't had the Korean War, the invasion by North, or by the regime in the North, invasion of the South, would you have had other similar things which had made the US dramatically increase their military budgets and all that? And the trouble is that it's really hard to deal with counterfactuals. It's really interesting to deal with counterfactuals, but really, really hard to do that, because you have to essentially rerun history once again and taking away one piece of information. In this thing here, in this example, you have to take away the Korean War. What would have happened in the Cold War if you had taken away the Korean War? Would it have reached the level of intensity it did? And we can speculate and make arguments based on theory, based on historical evidence. We can make some useful arguments with respect to these issues, but there's a limit to what we can know. The most famous example is perhaps, you know, Adolf Hitler. He wanted to enter and he applied for, you know, School of Arts, painting in Vienna back in long before the Second World War, but he was rejected. So Adolf Hitler, the painter, could not possibly, one would surmise, not possibly have been the dictator of Germany, the leader of the Nazi movement, Nazi party. And that's one of the most, you know, often referred to counterfactuals. What would have happened if Adolf Hitler had gotten accepted to that school? And Robert Jervis says about, you know, the escalation of the Vietnam War in the middle of the 1960s, this traumatic war from the American perspective, and he says that, you know, if it hadn't happened that, you know, the Viet Cong, the North Vietnamese, had attacked an American military base in 1965. If that hadn't happened, something else would have happened, which would have caused the Americans to gear up their war efforts in Vietnam. And that's the streetcar argument that, you know, okay, that wouldn't have happened, but something else would have happened. And we would have had the same end result. So, and then he goes on, you know, human beliefs can also generate black swans, which complicate the picture and complicates our ability to make use of theory and empirical evidence to judge what or to predict what would happen. That's part of the challenge of being in the social sciences, part of the challenge of being, you know, of answering the questions of journalists, because you often have to look into the future, and it's so difficult. So you have to make often conditional predictions. If this and that happens, then it's likely that this, or 60% likely that this happened. But then if this and this happen, then you will get another development in another direction. It's a complex system of interconnected parts. And in fact, Robert Jervis has written a whole book, which I think very few people have read. It's about, I think it's called Complex System Theory, something, an extremely interesting book about the complexity of systems, in this case international political systems, where a change in one part of the system, and that can happen far away, can, you know, effectuate changes that you in other parts of the system, and this happens all the time. So it's extremely difficult often to say something useful about developments 1 year from now, or 5 years, or 10 years. And human beings can also themselves jump into the equation and change the direction of history, such as the Soviet leader, former leader Mikhail Gorbachev. People can make mistakes, and it doesn't have to be people in prominent positions like Gorbachev or Donald Trump for that matter. If people start worrying about, you know, their savings from an individual perspective, it makes perfect sense to withdraw your savings from the bank. But if enough people think like that, the bank will go bust, and everybody who still has their money there will lose them. So these bank runs are inherently irrational, you know, from a group level perspective. But they're inherently rational from an individual perspective. But it makes it kind of, you know, difficult to predict. Same is true about actors' beliefs about the likelihood of war. Let's say in the US-Chinese context, you know, that can create tensions. The belief, the knowledge that similar incidences where one leading power is challenged by a rising power, we know from history. Graham Allison writes brilliantly about this in a quite recent book. And you have a project, I think, at Harvard University. They have studied 16 or something cases of these power changes among the great powers from the 1400s until today. And in 12 of these 16 cases, I think it is, these power changes ultimately led to war. The Americans know this, you know, more or less. The Chinese know that, you know, you had the First World War, some of the same mechanisms. You had, you know, the Napoleonic War, some of the same mechanisms. You had the wars between the Netherlands and Great Britain or England in the 17th century. You had all the wars against the French when Louis XIV were running France 300 or something years ago. You have all these, you know, power changes in relative power leading to wars, and very few of these situations leading to non-war between the main protagonists. That may make war more likely. It may cause, you know, the Americans and the Chinese to expect war and then to prepare for war. That's one, you know, basic possibility. But it can also have a self-denying dimension to it, because both the US and China knows that they know that these things have happened historically, that we are in dangerous territory. The US might not back down, and China wants to be more assertive. They want, you know, to change some of the rules of the game and change territories and all that. They don't want to live in an American-dominated world anymore, or Western-dominated world. But at the same time, they know that these situations are dangerous. So that's another possibility, is that these actors, based on theoretical knowledge and historical knowledge, they know they have to tread carefully. That can decrease the likelihood of war. But for us as students of these situations, we cannot really be certain about whether or not it is this or that possibility that will eventually be realized. Not least because we have to do with human beings managing or attempting to manage the situation. So it's fascinating being a you know, student of international relations, international security. But human beings can counteract theoretical predictions. So our theories can be perfectly right, and then human beings can actually make them be perfectly wrong, or they can counteract them. If they know that, big relative power changes have ended up in war, this time, that time, 12 times out of 16, then they can act on that premise, on that knowledge, and then you end up in a non-war, which kind of refutes the theory. It doesn't mean that the theory is wrong. Theory is not wrong. But it's an interesting thing which we have to be aware of when we study the acts of human beings. Robert Jervis also asks, what should we do? Because there's no prescriptions in Taleb's works about, he criticizes a lot, and he goes through many examples, and it's a good book, many years since I read it, by the way. But Jervis doesn't feel he confronts the question of what we should do as human beings. If we live in a world where we are affected by black swans quite often, how should we proceed? And that too is difficult. Climate change, he mentions, because there's a trade-off here. If we don't do anything, that may mean global disaster sometime from now. But at the same time, strong measures harms the economy, so there's a trade-off between, risk reduction in the future, or with reference to future generations. But then again, it's costly short-term, and in particular when you get into economic, financial trouble for other reasons, like a pandemic. US policy toward China, which, what should you do? Should you expect a war from the American perspective and then prepare for war, which might raise tensions? And the same goes for the Chinese. Should they expect a war which might, and the expectation might raise tensions, because you have to then prepare for war. You have to militarize to a greater extent and all that. Or should one bet that things will work out fine and relax tensions and do not prepare too much for war and reduce military spending and all that? It's one of the major issues in international security, and it's never straightforward. And then, of course, you have a basic trade-off, very interesting trade-off example, the risk of terrorists with nuclear weapons. How much resources should states use to counteract the risk or mitigate the risk of terrorists acquiring nuclear weapons? The likelihood of them doing so is extremely small, I would argue. Others would argue it's fairly substantial. But nuclear weapons, the ultimate weapons, they're really guarded by these states, 9 states that have them, and the terrorists themselves cannot possibly make a functioning nuclear weapon. And even if they acquire a nuclear weapon, it's not, detonating it is extremely difficult. So all this means really that the likelihood of a terrorist attack using nuclear weapons is really, really small. The effects of such an attack, the impact would be enormous. And then it's difficult for decision makers to decide how much resources to use on something that would most likely never happen. But it might happen. So is it okay then to spend $1 billion or $100 million or $10 billion or something like that? How worried should we be? These are fundamental trade-offs which have to do with the risk concept, impact times probability. And the world is full of such difficult trade-offs. Okay, in the end, near the end, Jervis says that at the very least, scholars must think more about black swans and be aware of their importance. while we need theories to guide our actions and indeed to make any sense of the world, there is a great danger in being excessively theory-driven. While we should try to explain as much as we can, we should not push our knowledge farther than it can go. And with these words, I think I'll end the second part. A much shorter third part will follow soon after I take a short break.